Yes, thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So I'm based at University of Queensland. I'm associate professor there, but I did my PhD in the UK at Cambridge, and it was looking at white working class boys. So I'm not going to speak too much about that. I've kind of pitched my presentation a little bit broader than that, looking at educational underachievement, boys and young men. And then I just like to start off with the fact that, I mean, this sort of notion. I have the quote there. It says, "Then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like a snail unwillingly to school." That is a quote from Shakespeare. And we've been talking about boys and disaffection literally since the 1580s. So, sorry, just to reiterate the quote there from Shakespeare from the 1580s. So, boys and disaffection toward formal schooling, which is what we're talking about at the end of the day. I think it's really important to strike that delineation between boys' disengagement from formal schooling and boys' disengagement from learning, because we know they're quite active learners in lots of different ways, just perhaps not always in the school context. But anyways, I think that's a good quote to begin with. So, as you'll be aware, sorry, my sort of ethos today is around taking identity seriously. And this follows on really nicely from what Dominic was really talking about. Dominic was talking about the identity and culture and getting that culture right that allows boys and a variety of different boys and different types of masculinities to flourish in his school setting. So, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was nodding my head the whole time that Dom was speaking. I mean, obviously, we've seen this sort of moral panic in around boys and education. But when I'm talking about identity, I am talking about masculinity and addressing it very clearly, much in the fashion that Dom did in the previous presentation. I mean, obviously, we have also, it's very difficult to study boys and their learning without considering the wider contextual factors. And I won't have time today to talk about, susceptibility to extremism, toxic masculinity, any of the big sort of hot topics at the moment, which, we've seen. But I think a lot what we've seen recently in the literature, and I know that perhaps the evidence base is not robust enough around this, is around the notion of boys defying masculine stereotypes and problematizing their sense of identity and their sense of masculinity, and how that can equate to a more pro-school culture, right? Not necessarily pro-learning. I think pro-learning is a separate thing, but in terms of a pro-school culture, where they're willing to play ball, they're willing to jump through the elaborate hoops that is the education system. So, we also know that we've seen a lot of robust notion around masculinity being very harmful to boys and their development broadly. And then also we've seen a situation there where it's very obviously counterproductive within a school environment. There's many studies out there that really problematize the notion of hypermasculinity and how some school cultures don't get it right. I know Dom is saying that his culture does get it right, but many school cultures don't get it right. And what you see there is a knock-on effect around not really dealing with boys, masculinities, and identities. And therefore, as you get that right, it's not even worth perhaps having a conversation about academic engagement. I think it's really important here to draw the point that boys understand their sense of self and their gender identity and how that significantly contributes to how they engage or disengage from their education and or their opportunities in and around education, right? Whether it's your standard secondary school qualification or it's your vocational pathway, all these things need to be celebrated and respected within that. And you see many schools where it is very much a focus on university and a downgrading or degrading, I should say, and around other routes to success. Okay, so I think also within this sort of thing, we've seen also like a small cottage industry develop around magic bullet solutions to boys in their educational attainment. And some of these solutions are fantastic. And I don't mean to pathologize them, but I think we have to be very suspicious about taking one solution from one place and putting it in another place, because we are talking about a lot of contextual issues here. And the last slide will really focus on those contextual developments. Okay, so I'm just going to outline some of the things that come to mind in terms of academic boys' underachievement. Obviously, this moral panic around their underachievement is related to the onset of standardized testing. So we know boys disaffected from formal education prior to standardized testing, but it's that data in around standardized testing and what that looks like that's really given this impetus in around magic bullet solutions, like seeing that moral panic and society being very concerned and around these issues. That's not to say those concerns are not valid. I'm just saying there is a wider history here. We're talking in the 80s, 80s, late 80s, early 90s with really standardized forms of testing. As Dom nicely said in the previous presentation, I think there is, schools by their very constitution create gender hierarchies within that. And I think you have to work with those hierarchies, but then at the same time, you have to problematize those hierarchies. And when you have a hierarchy, then you have people that are excluded or at the bottom rungs of that hierarchy, which does give impact to bullying and self-esteem. So what really resonated with me, what Dom was talking about, is the notion of a school culture respecting multiple masculinities, that you're validating different pathways, different types of boys, and different types of success within the school culture. That's not just focusing all your attention and resources on the DC borderline and what that looks like, that you're actually creating a culture there around a wider respect. And it's what Dom said was, I think, is a very challenging thing to establish and to maintain over time. And then I think it is worth just tipping the hat around literacy. We are talking about, we exist in a time of schooling where it's a very language-based curriculum, right? And we know that the early primary and secondary socialization and around boys and literacy creates a lot of issues where boys do struggle or don't spend the necessary time for whatever reason. To be an excellent reader and excellent writer takes an insane amount of time. And I think we need to understand that, boys don't necessarily, for a variety of reasons, spend that time developing their literacy. And as they move through their schooling, the literacy demands of the curriculum only become more challenging, right? So, the vocabulary becomes harder, the syntax becomes more challenging, and therefore it's easy. And it is a huge factor that contributes to their disengagement because you can't access a lot of the curriculum unless your reading and writing skills are pretty switched on. And I think there's a lot of evidence around the low literacy rates out there, but I won't go into that. I think also this notion around maintaining motivation and resilience, right? So, I mean, I taught as a teacher in South London for many years with boys and particularly white working class boys. And within that particular context, you do get these sort of glimmers of hope in and around, like, oh, they have a good week, and then they can't maintain it for that long, or there's a change in curriculum or change in home circumstances. All those things are part of that wider context affecting boys, where I think there's a lot. I don't like to use the term resilience too much, but it does, obviously the data suggests that girls seem to just get on with it a lot better than the boys. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But obviously we've seen in the UK, particularly also in the US, a huge emphasis on raising aspirations for boys, particularly boys from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And that's all tied to the shift to more of a knowledge-based economy and economic shift in and around it. And I think the next presentation is going to focus on that more, so I won't steal your thunder. Okay, and then also, I think there's a huge thing to consider around social class and the value of education. You see it at two ends of the spectrum, right? The boys from extremely wealthy backgrounds might be reluctant to engage in their education, as has been documented by Seamus Khan, other people like that within it, because they don't see the value of that education. And boys at the lower end of the spectrum, again, don't necessarily see the value of the education that it's going to equate to jobs or whatever it is. I mean, there's, even with the digital industries, we see, all these college dropouts, university dropouts within it. Okay. Going back to the notion of identities, because I do want to focus on identity as a really key part of the equation. But then within that, we've always seen this sort of persistent aspect of the effortless achiever, right? So boys, it's not that they necessarily engage or disengage from their education. It's very important for them in terms of the social currency to not look like they're engaging with their education. And when you don't look like you're engaging with your education for substantial periods of time, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's where the trickle is around this. So something that Dom mentioned in the previous presentation was the notion in and around, like, taking the stigma away and that respecting aspects of it and making a pro-school culture that boys could buy into. And this raises the rest notion of around the role models and that coaching. It was really interesting to see him using boys in his schooling context were pro-school to socialize the other boys that were maybe a little bit on the line or susceptible to aspects of disaffection. And then aspects here, you're always dealing with aspects of stereotypes and stereotypical cultures, right? So the stereotype around sports and drama and that's aspects around that is very stereotypical, getting boys to be up out of their seats and agentic learners, and increasing those aspects of engagement. Obviously, not all boys are interested in drama, and not all boys are interested in sports, and that. But then at the same time, you have to sort of work with those cultural stereotypes and sort of problematize those cultural stereotypes by also recognizing that. It's a really delicate balancing act that was sort of alluded to there before. And what we've seen in the last 10 years, coming out from like Michael Reichardt's research and stuff like that, is aspects in around teachers and relationships, right? So as a leverage point to motivate boys who might be, susceptible to disengaging right there. And obviously there's a huge aspect there around teachers socializing boys to norms and around certain behaviors within that. So this is very much a snapshot of what obviously is a wide field that's gone on pretty prominently since Paul Willis's work in 1977 to now. And obviously the nature of education has changed substantially over that time and the importance of it as well. So some things to just allude to, I promise there's only this slide and one more, is that many schools do not invest enough in the social and emotional development of boys. And I think there's a variety of complex reasons why that is. I think there's a reluctance. I think there's a lack of confidence of how best to do it. And I don't think we have a set of best practices that we can sort of tap into. I think there's a lot of recommendations out there, but I think it has to be very context specific. We know that teachers' expectations contribute significantly to how boys learn and how they see themselves as learners. And I think based on my own personal career experience, I've seen that a lot of times. I think we do see examples of teachers having, in certain circumstances, having quite low expectations of boys and boys really buying into that whole labeling theory. I mean, when you see it, enacted in your classroom, it can happen. I think boys are really sensitive to the perception of academic failure. And obviously we know that any form of learning involves a certain aspect of failure. You fail and you pull yourself back up again. So that sort of cycle and normalizing failure is a big part of the identity work that I think we should be working with boys. And boys are obviously sensitive to being seen as too academic, right? The all-powerful peer culture, as they call it in the literature. We know boys are more susceptible to peer pressure than girls generally. I know that's a bit of a gross generalization, but I think there's a lot of evidence there that supports it. And then performing the effortless achiever is really important to consider, and how the consequences for certain boys are higher around performing the effortless achiever. And then also, the peer pressure, as I mentioned before, but then also the schooling system itself. It was interesting what Dom was saying in the previous presentation about, not using too much of a tracking or streaming system, because you can go into most schools in most parts of the world that uses streaming and tracking sort of system within it, and you will see the boy heavy bottom sets. So obviously the schooling and the schooling cultures and these sort of normative practices there do sort of contribute to that culture within it. Last thing here is around boys in terms of relational learning, and I think that's important to consider. And I think, we've made some strides in terms of research within that, but at the same time, much further to go in terms of that relationship. How do we train teachers to be really effective in building relationships with boys? And obviously very contextual. And then just the last slide for me today is that this is a contextual problem, and therefore it requires a contextual solution. So therefore, there are many solutions that are bandied about out there. And I think we need to equip teachers and school leadership to choose solutions that work best for the students they work with. And really, what are the major influences of a gender identity and boys' engagement with their academic engagement, you could say, is the school, the home, the all-powerful peer group, and the demography or the intersectional factors within that. So just looking at this, you have certain leverage points of change, and then you have certain things that can't necessarily be changed, right? So the school can only do so much to compensate for the home and other things. Anyways, I will stop there because I would like hear the other presentation. Thank you very much.